episode of Made in America is brought to you by America's Inventor Lady and Home Talk USA. Home Talk is a proud member of the King's Broadcasting Network, which has been bringing you the best in home-based innovation since 1998.
Hi, everyone. Thank you so much for being with us for this episode of Made in America.
This segment is brought to you by the law offices of R.P. Baraska. RPB law offices have been bringing corporate-level legal expertise to the independent inventor community for more than 20 years. For all your inventing legal needs, trust rpblawoffices.com.
Hello, and welcome to the Chairman's Countdown with Zach Mottl. I'm your host, Zach Mottl, and as always, I'm joined by John Toomey, president of the Coalition for a Prosperous America. We're coming to you across your radio on the Home Talk USA radio network, and we're also streaming nationwide live at hometalkusa.com. Today, we're honored to welcome someone who has become one of the strongest voices in Congress on reshoring America's drug manufacturing and also confronting our dangerous over-reliance on China and India for our medications, our generic drugs, and the active pharmaceutical ingredients that make those up. I'm really honored. We've got Congressman Buddy Carter here with us today. Thank you, Congressman, for joining us. And John Toomey again with the Coalition for Prosperous America. Great to be with you. Let's dive in. Congressman, you've been a leader on this issue, and we're really grateful for that. This is important. What first opened your eyes to how dependent America has become on China and India for pharmaceuticals?
Well, first of all, professionally, I'm a pharmacist, so I understand this issue quite well, and I understand the need. And I say all the time, we put a lot of emphasis on needing energy independence, as we should, but we also need pharmaceutical independence. And I will tell you, this was really brought to light, I think, and as a member of the of Congress and as a healthcare professional. I'm a member of the Doctors Caucus, and we were meeting in the Doctors Caucus with the Assistant Secretary for Preparedness and Emergency Response, Dr. Bob Cadillac. And he was telling us, he said, even though we didn't know about the virus, the pandemic, until February or March of 2020, we went back and looked, and we saw a downtick in the amount of PPI and the amount of drugs that China was sending us back in 2019, in the fall of 2019. China knew what was going on, and they started hoarding these drugs, and they started building up their own supply and not sending them to us. That drove home the point that we need pharmaceutical independence in this country. In 1972, in 2002, almost 72.5% of the drugs that were consumed here in America were made here in America. In 2023, that number was down to 37.5%. 37.5% down from 72% only 20 years ago. That tells us that we're becoming more and more reliant on other countries for our pharmaceutical needs, particularly adversarial countries, particularly China. And, in pharmacy, there is the Active Pharmaceutical Ingredients. We call it API. It's the start of everything. It's what you have to have in order to make a drug, to manufacture a drug. 90% of the antibiotics that are made here in America depend on API that comes from China. Now, we get 50% of our antibiotics from India already, but India also depends on China for API, for active pharmaceutical ingredients. So China has essentially cornered the market, if you will, on the API. And that tells us that we need to become less dependent and more independent for our pharmaceutical supplies.
That's right, Congressman. Those numbers you cited, that dramatic shift over the last 20 years, it didn't happen by accident, right? Maybe we weren't doing anything about it, but they sure were. They had an active plan to take these things over. And whether it's to get control, in a crisis or whatever, God forbid we can worry about all those doomsday and worst case scenario if we ever get into conflict or something. But this is no way for a developed nation, a nation supposedly the strongest, greatest nation on the planet Earth, to be running our health supply chain. We don't make our own. You mentioned the antibiotics, but even acetaminophen and ibuprofen, over 90% of those come from overseas, painkillers. And we certainly have seen the adulteration of product. I mean, you can go back a couple of years to when Zantac 75 got pulled because it had carcinogens in it. We saw heparin, we saw blood pressure medication. And, you probably have a lot of perspective on this, but I've heard from doctors, especially doctors who, cancer, they're treating some advanced things. They switch a patient to what's supposed to be an equivalent drug, and they notice it reacts differently, and their patient, in some cases, dies. And I don't think we're doing a very good job recording of this. Have you seen any of this in your practice? And, before Congress, did you see this kind of stuff that not as effective as it should be, perhaps?
Oh, absolutely. There was a study done in 2025 that showed that the occurrence of serious adverse effects for generic drugs that were manufactured in India was 54% more than it was for drugs that were manufactured here in America. We've always known that we've had a problem with the FDA and the inspections that go on overseas. Understandably, it's more difficult for them to inspect pharmaceutical manufacturers and plants overseas than it is over here. But we're still taking those drugs, and we still need them to be of the utmost quality, and they're not.
Absolutely right, Congressman. And John, we've got members as the Coalition for Prosperous America. We represent quite a few members making drugs here in America. Their experience with the FDA is very different than those foreign ones. What have we seen, John, some of our members? What do you hear from people out on the streets?
Oh, sure. Well, there's two sets of rules, right? There's rules for foreign production. Those guys get advanced lead time, like the congressman's talking about. They'll tell you, hey, we're showing up on a Tuesday 3 months from now. And, they have every notice available to them when the FDA is showing up. Our folks, whether they're making injectables, solid dose, liquid oral, the FDA shows up unannounced. But that's what you want, right? You want a system and a regulatory program that encourages good manufacturing practices. And the U.S. is still the gold standard in production. I argue the Europeans do a fine job as well producing generic products in Europe. But again, you cannot expect to have quality medication coming into this country from India or China if they are not playing by the same sets of rules that the U.S. is playing by. And it's a terrible system the way it currently is run.
That's right, John. We've heard the complaints from our members. And the other side of it, besides, Americans are not paying less for their health care, right? But they are getting worse and worse quality when it comes to these generic pharmaceuticals because of this offshoring. But the other side is that we're losing good jobs. These pharmaceutical manufacturers, this is high-tech manufacturing. They buy a lot of equipment. They have capital investments, and they have employees, and they typically pay a far above average wage for the region they operate in. So we're losing the good drugs. We don't have the security in our healthcare system, and we don't have good jobs. And, we've seen certainly drug shortages around the country, antibiotics, cancer medications, just critical generics. Congressman, you've probably heard some of this up on the Hill there. Do you know why are we seeing such widespread shortages? What's happening in the system? It seems like it's broken.
Well, it is broken. And one of the primary reasons that it's broken is because we are so dependent on other countries. So if something happens over there, it impacts us over here. And it has impacted us over here, and it continues to impact us over here. Yet another reason why we need pharmaceutical independence. Another reason we need to be manufacturing these drugs so that we're not dependent. It's one thing for them to the quality of the drug and is very important, as you just pointed out. The quality is very important. But if we're not going to be able to get the drug, period, which with China, an adversarial country, that's a weapon for them, a weapon that we can ill afford to allow them to have and ill afford to be held hostage by them in order for them to gain whatever it is they may want to gain.
That's right.
And I would just add one piece in there, Congressman. It was India during the pandemic who first withheld medication as well. And although we like India, right, they're not China, they still look after their population first and foremost. And so that's why it's so vital that we have that productive capacity here at home, because India is going to look after India. We cannot be dependent on them for our basic medication. So I just always flag that for folks because, we always talk about China, but, India's adopted the same playbook when it comes to dominating this industry. It's why today they have over 25 different productive linked incentive schemes, tax subsidies that allow their producers to bottom out the price of a product and corner the market.
Yeah, and at the root of this too, it's that we talk about friends and allies, right? You say India is a friendly nation, maybe we consider them different than China, but at the root of this, friends and allies doesn't matter. It's a matter of national security. We have to have it here. It's not that you're our friend. It's that we've made a decision that it needs to be here, and this is not a way to run a nation like America. I mean, it's certainly putting strain on the healthcare, and I don't know, is this bringing costs down? Is anyone saving any money because of this? Who's benefiting from this financially?
Well, obviously, the countries who are manufacturing the drugs are benefiting from this. And no, it is not bringing the prices down at all. In fact, we would be better served if we had more competition here in America with pharmaceutical manufacturing. So it's not helping in that respect at all. And I just couldn't agree with you more that we have got to make sure, yes, friendshoring is important. And we need to make sure that we're manufacturing it here and that we encourage our friends and incentivize our friends to make sure that they manufacture it as well. But nothing takes the place of manufacturing it here in America. And that's what we have to keep in mind. And keep in mind, yes, India did withhold those 26 drugs, as you pointed out, and that's a great point. But remember, the key is the APIs, the active pharmaceutical ingredients.
Well, we're going to get more into that, Congressman. We've got to take a quick commercial break, and I want to get into some solutions when we get back. So don't go anywhere to those of you listening. We'll be right back with more of the Chairman's Countdown here on the Home Talk Radio Network and streaming live across America at hometalkusa.com. I'm Zach Mottl. This is the Chairman's Countdown with the Coalition for Prosperous America. We'll be right back with Congressman Carter talking about bringing drug manufacturing home.
This segment is brought to you by SearchQuest Patent Search. SearchQuest provides for a comprehensive patent search that searches the entire world and not just the U.S. Patent Office. Make sure that before you spend those big bucks having a patent written, you've done your due diligence by getting a comprehensive patent search. Use SearchQuestPatents.com for all your patent search needs. They scour the world for you.
Hi, everyone. Welcome back to the Chairman's Countdown. I'm your host, Zach Mottl, Chairman of the Coalition for a Prosperous America, and we're coming to you today on the Home Talk Radio Network. Before the break, we were just talking with Representative Buddy Carter about some of the problems in the American generic drug and the active pharmaceutical industry, how we really offshored our national security, offshored our medical supply chain, and offshored all those good jobs in the manufacture of generic pharmaceuticals. So we heard a little bit about the problem before the break, and now I want to focus on some possible solutions here in the next segment. Congressman, you introduced perhaps one of the most important bills in Congress to address these problems, and I certainly want to thank you for your leadership on this. Like you said, you've kind of had a front row seat to this as a pharmacist. You've seen the issue live before you got to Congress, but thank you for taking the reins and trying to fix it. What does your Made in America legislation do to move the API and the drug production back to the United States?
Well, first of all, let's get the acronym MADE. Manufacturing API, active pharmaceutical ingredients, drugs, and excipients in America. Excipients are inadvertent materials that are necessary in order to hold molecules together in order to make the manufacturing process work. So what we need is to incentivize companies through targeted tax incentives to come back to America. As I mentioned earlier in the show about the amount of drugs that were produced in America in 2002 as compared to 2023, 72% to 37.5%. We obviously have lost traction here and we've lost ground, and we need to do something to incentivize these companies to come back to this country and do manufacturing here. And that's what we're trying to do through this. We're using some of the tax zones, some of the that were popular with Senator Tim Scott that he passed in some of his legislation. that we're really trying to incentivize. And I would submit to you that President Trump has done a pretty good job with this. In fact, he's bringing companies to America. Johnson & Johnson broke ground on a $2 billion facility in North Carolina. Amgen, a $900 million manufacturing expansion in Ohio. And AbbVie committed $10 billion to invest in the United States. And Sanofi, they announced plans to invest at least $20 billion. So we're getting their attention. And I think this is good. And I applaud the president for what he's done. He gets it. He understands how important this is. And this is the way that we get out of this hole. You know, when I mentioned earlier about China held us hostage, about India holding those drugs, fool me once, shame on you. Fool me twice, shame on me. If we don't learn from this, then shame on us.
That's right, Congressman. We have certainly seen this before. And, I would hate to see a repeat, God forbid, another pandemic or another conflict, but the world isn't always peaceful and stable. Things are going to happen. And again, not to mention, I'm a big fan of the good jobs in America. I'm an America First guy. And I think that we should be, if our healthcare system, if it's taxpayers or I'm subsidizing, my employees are paying for it, or we're paying for it with our health insurance costs, we should be having the good jobs here. And all those investments, kudos to the president. He really has been a leader on this. And he has been so bold to break the mold and the way we've been doing it for the last 30 years. But, we need to do more. I think he has more tools in the tool belt. He's got the Section 232 tariff investigations. He can really focus on the national security aspect of this, because what I would hate to see, all those investments that you highlighted, is to have them wasted. Too often we get companies to make the investment and build the capacity, but then we don't protect them and we let them be predated, because, the Chinese and the Indians, they're not going to sit down and take this. They're going to lower the price and lower the price. And, I think we're talking about a fraction of a penny a pill here. It's not a lot, but over millions of pills, it adds up. So I think your bill is so important to give some incentives to make sure that those investments that they have made pay off. And I know, John, we represent quite a few generic drug manufacturers. Would you say there's like billions of dollars, maybe even trillions of potential investments sitting on the sideline, in addition to what the congressman mentioned, right? There are companies ready to come here if we can give them a little more clarity. Are you seeing that out there? What are you seeing on this?
1,000%. There is very strong interest to come here to build productive capacity. And, you see it both in the API space, with some really great production that we have in Europe currently that wants to come to the U.S., that wants to, retrofit facilities, build new facilities. You see it in, some of the product classes as well. Maybe people looking to expand our fermentation capabilities to build antibiotic production here. We have one company making antibiotics in this country, which is great, but that's not enough, right? It's called U.S. Antibiotics in East Tennessee. So there's certainly a lot of interest. There's certainly a lot of eagerness from, I'd say, companies who have adherence to good manufacturing practices. You put them in the gold category, and they're kind of waiting on the sidelines, right? Like Congressman has this great legislation that really would force the government to buy American, right? When they're using API made here in the U.S. That has to happen. We have to do a better job of ensuring our procurement policies match our policy outcomes, right? So that we're supporting the investment here, that we're buying American made. It shouldn't be, it was a great story. And in the Senate, they covered this a couple of weeks ago, a company called Oxford Pharmaceuticals. They testified and said, hey, look, we make this product in Alabama. We lost a VA contract to an Indian Chinese front operation in Long Island, right? Where the product is 100% coming in, made with both parts from China and India. And that's ridiculous for a company that's employing 200 folks in Alabama, making it the right way, sourcing the API either domestically or from Europe when available. That shouldn't happen. But that's currently, the system's broken and we have to fix it.
Yeah, well, you've highlighted something else that I wanted to bring up. The Department of War, they're the biggest buyer, single buyer of pharmaceuticals and generics medicine, right? They've got to keep our soldiers ready wherever they're at. And they also have some stockpiles. I think, Congressman, you focused a little bit on the strategic stockpile and domestic readiness. It's not just about making the drugs, but we need to have a little stash of them ready to go in a crisis. What are your thoughts on that, on the stockpile and domestic production?
Well, what we did with the State Strategic Stockpile Act is to allow the states to have their own stockpiles. Now, we are not trying to replace the federal stockpiles, the national stockpiles. They are important. We need them. However, every state is different. What a state may need in the way of ventilators, in the way of drugs, may be different from another state. So that's why we introduced this legislation so that the states could have their own stockpiles that would complement the federal stockpiles. And this is certainly something that is necessary.
Absolutely. And, again, as we worry about, costs and are we going to have enough supply and things like that, transparency is another thing that I think you've focused on also in your work. Why is it so important? And does the FDA even really know where some of these things are coming from, these pharmaceuticals in the supply chain, or is it kind of like, let's hope and pray it is what it's supposed to be?
Well, first of all, the FDA is doing a better job now that we've got new leadership in. I'm a big fan of Dr. Markery and what he's doing at the FDA, and I feel like he'll get it under control. But you're right. In the past, we have not had almost a clue as to exactly what was coming through into this country and being put on the market. And that is very important. Now, I think it would be appropriate now to mention something else about the API, and that is...
Just got a few minutes, Congressman.
Okay.
Seconds.
And the API is very important because of permitting and because the rules and regulations here in America are much more difficult and much more stringent than they are in China.
Well, let's get more into that in a minute. We're going to take another quick commercial break. Everybody listening, don't go anywhere. Don't touch your dial. We'll be right back with more of the Chairman's Countdown, talking about making America secure, safe, and healthy, and good jobs for good Americans with Congressman Buddy Carter. We'll see you in a few moments.
If you're an inventor or you know an inventor out there who would just like to be able to have a conversation with other inventors, join the Inventors Roundtable. It's free. The meetings are virtual, so you can be anywhere in America and talk to another inventor. And for a lot of folks out there, understanding the process, being able to ask questions, getting good service provider information is critical to the inventing process. So, got questions? Want to join? It's free. inventorsroundtable.org.
Hello out there. Welcome back to the Chairman's Countdown. I'm your host, Zach Mottl, Chairman of the Coalition for a Prosperous America. We're coming to you today on the Home Talk Radio Network, across the airwaves, and online at hometalkradio.com. We've been honored to be joined with Congressman Buddy Carter, and we've been talking today about the landscape of the generic drug manufacturing and the active pharmaceutical manufacturing here in America. And unfortunately, it's not really that good. We've offshored a significant chunk, in some cases 90% or more, of our manufacturing of the ingredients as well as the drugs that are required to operate every single hospital, every single ambulance. There's about 300 generics on every ambulance, and most of them aren't made here. And the other part of it is we're not getting the good jobs that come out of making those medicines. So luckily, the congressman has been a leader on this, and he's introduced the Made in America legislation that we talked about. That's MADE, and the acronym matters. It relates to the drugs and the active pharmaceuticals and the ingredients that bind it all together. So we're really grateful for all of that. And we were just talking, Congressman, about, some of the active pharmaceutical and like where it's made, the transparency of it, and do we even know? And we were getting into some permitting and legislative issues that you were going to highlight. If you want to pick that up, I know our listeners would love to hear what you were saying about the API supply chain.
Well, keep in mind that all drugs start with APIs. If you don't have it and the active pharmaceutical ingredient, you're not going to be able to make the drug. So that's why, with China controlling almost 90% of that market, that is not a good situation for anyone in the world to be in except for China. And that's why it's so vitally important. But one of the primary reasons for this is because of the regulations and the permitting that we have here in America. Now, look, we all care about our environment. We all care about the quality of our medications and of our food and everything else. But I got to tell you this, Zach. I don't care what sector of our economy you're talking about, whether it be healthcare, whether it be energy or technology. When companies are coming in my office, it's always the same thing. Permitting, regulations, crushing us. And we've got to do something about that. And this administration, the Trump administration, understands that, and they are trying to do it. We are not settling for anything less than what we have in the past, but we're just making it clear that, some of this may be unnecessary and we can streamline a lot of this, particularly when it comes to APIs, the active pharmaceutical ingredients. These are things that we need to be doing here in America. We understand that, but because of the permitting, because of the regulations, it is very, very difficult. It's just one of those things that just because you do more of it doesn't necessarily mean it's good or that it's necessary. So sometimes you can do fine with just enough, and that's what we're trying to do here.
Congressman, I'm in manufacturing too. We just had this conversation this morning with my quality department. We make rocket parts, we make ejector seat parts, we make mission critical landing gear components. And, just checking it more and doing more activity on it doesn't necessarily make the quality better. It can certainly drive the cost up and slow the process down, but it doesn't necessarily yield a better part. There are other ways to ensure quality. So I think it's the same thing here with the permitting process. More doesn't always mean better. We've got to pick the right things to check. Are these state and federal issues, or a little, is it both, or is it mostly federal on these permitting issues?
It's mostly federal. There are some state, but most of it is federal, and that's where it needs to be addressed at the federal level.
Well, good. I hope we can get on top of that because, we need to get these, not only, again, the national security back, the innovation back, but the good jobs back. I'm always concerned. I want a worker-centric economy. And I recognize that when we bring demand back for production in America, what it does is it causes wages to rise broadly. And there's a lot of conversations happening in America right now about, affordability, but I think that that's focused on the wrong thing, not necessarily bringing prices down. It would be great if we could stabilize prices, but what we really need to get happening is wages rising faster than costs. And the number one way to do that for any economy in the world, it's been proven over and over and over again, is manufacturing, be it generic drug manufacturing, steel making, production, mining, refining of minerals and metals. All of these are ways to make our population wealthier and more prosperous compared to their costs. So, the drugs, there's a huge opportunity here. And John, I think, you're seeing a lot of this too with our members here. It sounds like there's potentially quite a bit of investment and quite a bit going on behind the scenes that maybe hasn't made the headlines yet. Is that right? Can you give us a little color on that?
Oh, yeah. No, look, I touched on it in the previous segment. There's definitely investment that's on the sidelines. I think there's investment being made in certain, states here regarding generic drug production. And you're right to call out, these are high-wage jobs. I mean, traditionally there was the pharma belt, right? This area, Route 202 outside Philadelphia up into North Jersey, historically that was a big area of pharmaceutical production, parts around Chicago, even out west a little bit more. And these are great jobs. You look at those counties and how they were doing quite well when we had those manufacturing jobs there. And as the Congressman rightly noted, a lot of those jobs have moved overseas. We've lost a lot of that productive capacity, but there's investment, like I said, from producers who have a good track record of adhering to good manufacturing practices, which is most critical, right? We want to attract good production in this country. We want to attract companies who are doing it the right way, who will employ Americans, who will, ensure that we have greater capacity here at home. And, I think it's a bipartisan issue. We certainly hear bipartisan calls for this. I guess the question I have for the Congressman while we have him here is, look, Made in America legislation is wonderful. Do you believe that you might get a vote here in the next year, before we round out this Congress, or what's it look like to you, Congressman? It sounds like we just heard the Senate had a bipartisan hearing on this topic the other week.
Yes, you're absolutely right. And thank you for mentioning this. I tell people all the time, I'm on the Health Subcommittee of Energy and Commerce. We're the Committee of Jurisdiction. In fact, I was chair of that subcommittee for the first 6 months of this year. But nevertheless, I always say that when it comes down to healthcare, we all want the same thing, whether we're Democrats, Republicans, or independent. You want accessible, affordable, quality healthcare. Accessible, affordable, quality healthcare. That's what we all want. And yes, this is bipartisan. It's just as important for a Democrat to get this medication during the pandemic as it is for a Republican, and vice versa. So we've got bipartisan support on this bill. We've got a number of bipartisan supporters and signatures on this. And It does help us tremendously, and I think everybody recognizes. And when I say everybody, I mean across the aisle. I think they recognize the importance of this. In fact, when I was chair of that health subcommittee, we had a bipartisan hearing that on the pharmaceutical supply chain and in our efforts to reduce our reliance on China and adversarial countries, and it was bipartisan. Everyone was singing off the same song sheet in that hearing.
Yeah, Congressman, I'll ask you this too. We have this great opportunity before us with this 232 investigation. I'm sorry, Zach, I'm going to go on the 232s here a little bit, but we have not seen the findings yet on that, right? And we all expect a national security finding to be made on generic drugs. And the Commerce Department has many tools, right? They can pull from the interagency. They can task, the Defense Production Act. They can look at even procurement. Has that been a conversation since we have a favorable administration to this topic? Has that been a conversation or a track that you and your colleagues and the Doctors Caucus and others who are sponsoring this legislation have thought about or have had with the Commerce Department to say, hey, we're going to try to pass this legislation, understanding it's not the easiest thing to do on Capitol Hill these days, but let's find ways to chip away at this with the powers that the Commerce Department and others within the executive have. Has that been a conversation that you've had lately, Congressman, or do you see receptivity to?
No, we do. We have talked about it, and we will continue to talk about it. And not to diminish the importance of this, but be quite honest with you, we've just had such other bigger fish to fry. Now, we had 43-day government shutdown. Right now, we're with healthcare costs in general. So not to make any excuses, but yes, it is on the radar, and it is something that we're looking at very, very closely and something that we intend to pursue.
And what about our listeners and people listening? Is this the kind of thing they could call the representative and encourage some action on? Would you think that would be a helpful thing?
No question about it. Advocacy is always helpful. Keep in mind, we have a citizen legislature. We've got 2 pharmacists, we got 2 urologists, we got new car salesmen, we got way too many lawyers. But at the same time, the point is that we need your advocacy. This is important for every listener on this radio station right now. Everyone who's listening to this is going to make sure that you have reliable, affordable, accessible health care and medication. And we need to let our members of Congress know that. So I would encourage you, please call your member of Congress. Let them know how important this is, and we need their help on this.
Yep, we can get this done together. And yeah, with your help, please support the MADE, M-A-D-E, in America legislation and encourage them to support any legislation, any work to move the active pharmaceutical ingredients in the drug manufacturing back to America. Like we said, it's good jobs and good medicine for America. We've got to take a quick commercial break here. We're going to come back with the final segment, and we'll talk a little bit about some closing thoughts on this, but don't go anywhere. Congressman Carter is going to join us for the final segment. John Toomey, president from the Coalition for the Prosperous America, and I'm Zach Mottl, your host and chairman of the Coalition, and we're coming to you today on the Home Talk Radio Network. Don't touch your dial, don't hit your button, don't touch your mouse. We'll be back in a few moments.
Hi, this is a training pull-up for little boys, and it's a great product to use. It makes it easy for the parent and the child when learning how to potty train. The coolest part about the product is that you don't have to take the child's pants all the way down every time that they need to use the restroom. You can just open this part here, and the child can tinkle through here, and it makes it easy for the parent and the child. It's a great product, and I cannot wait until it hits the market.
Hey everybody, welcome back to the Chairman's Countdown. I'm your host, Zach Mottl, chairman of the Coalition for a Prosperous America, and we are coming to you today across America on the Home Talk Radio Network. And before this break, we were just talking with Congressman Buddy Carter and John Toomey from the Coalition for a Prosperous America about America's drug supply chain, the generics. These are the drugs that you take every day. You probably didn't hear about them on a commercial or on TV. They're not sexy. They're not exciting. They're really not that expensive either. But they are the drugs that a country can't function without. This is everything from blood pressure medication, allergy medication, antacids, cancer drugs, heparin. It's everything. But people don't think too much about these until they're not available. And unfortunately, we saw some shortages recently, whether it's due to supply chain quality issues from these overseas drugs that aren't made to the same proper standards that we have here in America. And we certainly don't have the legal and the regulatory oversight to reach deep into China or deep into India to deal with the problems. We've seen shortages because of quality issues. And we've also seen, doctors and patients suffer and even die because of quality issues, drugs that dissolve too quickly or too slowly. And here at the Coalition for Prosperous America, we represent a growing base of the generic drug manufacturers who are working hard to reshore the supply chain to America. And Congressman Carter has been a leader with some legislation to help them do that and encourage these drugs to come back. Because it's not just the supply chain and the safe medicine, it's also the good jobs for your neighbors, good jobs for Americans. Don't you want all your health insurance money, creating a good job for you, your children, your neighbor? So, some of our members, I've heard from them some of their experiences, and I won't say their name or anything, but one member told me, they make a generic drug here in America that actually is not made overseas. It's kind of a lower volume one. But they were approached by the Chinese, and they were even invited to China to bring, they wanted to import this ingredient into China. And, normally I would be all for that, exporting our products to another country. But what I heard from them was shocking. And I think it kind of sets the tone for what goes on with these overseas manufacturers. They went over to meet with them and, they usually package these in sterile vials and they ship them in sterile vials to the end user. And, the buyers in China said, oh, we don't need the sterile vials. We don't want that. We want it in 55-gallon drums. And they said, well, that wouldn't be safe. That, people could die. And you know what they were told? This is China. People die every day. And so if that's the kind of attitude that you want in the medicine that's in your medicine cabinet, in the pill that you take in the morning or in the evening, if that's the attitude you want, let's just keep more of this. But it's not what I want, and it's certainly not what America deserves. And so, Congressman, again, thank you for all your leadership on this. What are, I mentioned this risk here. What do you see as the biggest risk if the U.S. fails to rebuild its pharmaceutical base here in America?
Well, as we stated early on, we talk about energy independence all the time, and that is important, yes, and we should talk about it. But pharmaceutical independence, if we become too reliant on China or adversarial countries for our pharmaceuticals, then we put ourselves in a precarious position. And after the experiences that we had during the pandemic with China and with India, the two major suppliers of medication to our country, we should understand and heed the warnings of this. You brought out a lot of great points in this interview, and not the least of which was also domestic manufacturing and how important it is to our labor force. And it's good paying jobs that we're talking about here. But we do not have an availability of antibiotics or other medications. We put ourselves in a very precarious position and put our citizens in a very precarious position that we should not let happen. This is something that can be prevented. It can be deterred, and we need to make sure that we do it. We need to incentivize companies to come and manufacture active pharmaceutical ingredients as well as the final products here in America to assure quality, to assure that we have the inventory that we need in order for our citizens to have medications.
Yeah, it just seems pretty simple to me, Congressman. But unfortunately, it also, until there's a crisis, we saw it in the pandemic. You'd think that would have been a big enough warning. We've been worried about rare earths, and for good reason. Those are important too. But we're not going to care about magnets or cars or computers when we don't have insulin, right? Or something else like that. So to me, this is base. Maslow's hierarchy of needs, right? This is base. This is security. This is food, nutrition, security. We have got to get this solved. So I implore you, thank you for working with your colleagues, on this bipartisan legislation, this Made in America legislation. And earlier we asked the listeners, listen, call your representative, whatever district you're in, please call the office and just leave a friendly message and say, hey, that you support bringing the American generic drug supply chain back home and the Made legislation. And, it just really can change the trajectory on this thing, because we're talking less than a penny a pill. John, are we worried about inflation if this passes? We're not hearing that. What are our members saying if they get this? Is prices going to go through the roof, or what do you think's going to happen?
No. That's a red herring that you'll hear from folks who don't want to do this. It's a lazy school thought. What we've seen here is there's so much in the actual from the time that the product is made to the time it gets to the patient the markup is insane when you look at the middlemen, right? I know the Congressman's been very focused on the middlemen, but between the insurers, the hospitals, the middlemen, there's massive room to absorb any sort of price increase. And Andrew Reschenberg, one of our top economists at CPA, did a study on this that looked at exactly that question and found that there'd be zero price increase passed on to the patient. And so, the idea that we'd see an increase here is just a farce. And really, it's about taking action and taking bold action to ensure that we limit our dependence on foreign-made product.
Yeah, we've got to get the globalist attitude out of our medical supply chain. And I'm on in my real life, when I'm not on the radio here, the job that actually pays my bills is a manufacturing company, and we make tooling and components and parts for machinery and equipment, including the machines that make food products as well as generic drugs, medication. So there are companies like mine, again, waiting to support the supply chain. We're looking to see these businesses come back to America. There are workers waiting for these jobs, and there's patients who need good medicine and doctors who want to administer it. So I think, the answers are right here in front of us. The will to move forward and break away from this, it can be done. There's no reason we haven't done it yet. Is there one takeaway, John or Congressman Carter, that you want to leave for American producers, patients, and families that might be listening to this today? Anything we haven't covered that you want to hit on? Any final takeaways here?
Again, at the end of the day, we all want the same thing. We want accessible, affordable, quality health care. Here we have an opportunity to impact all three of those. Accessibility to the drugs, affordability. We can do it cheaper here in America if we do. And then quality. We can make sure that we don't suffer through the examples that you stated earlier, where we had the heparin problems, where we had the Zantac problems. All of those things. I remember I was practicing at the time.
Yep.
And I can tell you that that's not a good situation for us to be in. Not a little bit of work.
Not at all, Congressman. And with your help, we're going to solve it. And here at the Coalition for a Prosperous America, we're fighting every day for American producers. I want to thank you, Congressman Carter. Thank you, the listeners. And thank you, John Toomey. We'll see you next week on the Chairman's Countdown on Home Talk Radio Network.